This is just a very quick video to respond to a request on a recent video. In that video I was repairing a mechanical calculator and I had a component that was kind of similar to this. It had a slot in it that had worn too wide, and part of the repair was to close up the slot so that the free play, the slack in the lever could be dealt with. It was just wobbling about and wasn't doing its job properly. In response to that video, I was asked to show how I closed up the slot, and I said at the time you just don't beat on it randomly with a hammer, and so I thought what I'd do is just very quickly show how I would go about doing that, and also I had a question as to how I would make a new part if the part was completely unrecoverable, so it was too badly damaged, and how would I go about making a new one. And obviously the answer is it depends entirely on the part. Now, if you're not interested in metalwork and how to make small parts like this, then please skip this video. I'll be fairly brief, but how you go about this kind of depends on what tools you have in the workshop, but I just thought I'd give one example as to how you can go about doing this sort of thing. So if you need to make a new one from scratch, then the way I go about it is, if it's a complex shape, so the one in question, I can't remember the exact shape, but it was something like this. But if it's a complex shape, then what I would do is break it down into different planes. This is just something I very quickly machined and filed to shape just so I could do this demonstration. But what I would do is I would start with the major face. I would then draw around it. You can do this on the CAD system if you have one, but I'm going to try and make this video as simple as I can, and so avoid any use of CAD systems or tools that you might not have. So I would start by drawing around the component, being fairly accurate, and then marking the center line of the next plane, and that's the point at which you want the center of material. And then we would have basically a bend mark, a fold mark that we could keep track of, and then we'd move on to the next face, put the part back down, and now we center this on that line but centering on the other face, and then we would draw around this part of the part, and we'd keep doing that for any faces that we'd identify. The only thing to bear in mind here is that you need to allow additional material or less material depending on what this dimension is intended to be and what this dimension is intended to be, because obviously you're going to lose or gain effectively material when you do the bend, so you need to allow for that, and there are tables for this. It's basically related to the radius of the bend and the thickness of the material, so it depends on exactly what the nature of the bend is. So once you've got this, you can then transfer this onto sheet metal, cut it out, and again, depending on the equipment, you might want to leave a little bit excess. If you can't bend extremely accurately, you might want to leave it with a bit of extra material. Kind of depends on how accurate the part needs to be as well. And once you've got it cut out, and assuming that it's filed before you bend to the finished size, then that's the part complete. But if you've machined it slightly oversized, then once you've finished bending it, then you'd adjust it with a file or whatever you've got to the final dimensions. If you need to blue it, you then polish it up, heat treat it to give it to the colour that you want, and that's the part complete. So in this case, and that's the easy route, so it can be easier sometimes making a part from scratch than it can repairing one. But what we're going to do here is close up this slot, and that's essentially what I did when I repaired the part in the video. So we'll take this over to the workshop. Now, I don't normally show anything I do in the workshop. It's not really suitable over there for videoing, but also it's quite a hike over there, so I don't want to keep carting the tripod and camera and whatever else over there, so I tend to go over there, do the work, and then bring the parts back. But just to demonstrate this, we'll take the camera over and I'll show how I would go about making this slot narrower. Okay, so we're in the workshop. Apologies if there is flickering from the lights. As I said, it's not really suitable over here for video, which is why I don't normally do it. First thing we need to do is decide how we're going to hold the part, and it again depends on the shape of the part. So in this instance I'm going to clamp it on the two faces, so rather than just clamp it in a vise, we'll find some offcuts of material, and what I'm trying to do here is compress these two curves. Metal's not quite as rigid as you might think. You can manipulate it as long as you're fairly careful. So I want to clamp this fairly firmly, so I want a material that's slightly softer than this material. So we'll find a couple of blanks and we'll have just enough material poking up so we can gain access to the part we need to apply pressure to, and then put a second piece on, and then we need to find something suitable to clamp this in. So in this case I'll use this. I'd normally use a bigger vise, but I don't want to try and carry it across to the bench, so I can video it, but this will give you the idea as to roughly how I would go about doing this. So open up the vise, drop the piece in, okay, tighten it down. So we want it to be quite tight. I want the soft material to actually start to close in on the part that we're going to work on. Okay, so when it's good and tight, the next step, I would normally do this in the hydraulic press, so I'll just move the camera across to the press and show you how I would go about doing that, but I'll then finish this off with a hammer. I said we shouldn't beat randomly on these with a hammer, but if you're careful then there are methods you can use that won't damage it. But I'll show you the way I would normally do this first. Okay, hopefully you can see this. I've got the vise in the hydraulic press, and what we'd normally do now is press down on the two ends with the hydraulic press. The ram's under here, you probably can't see it, but I get very fine control over the amount of movement on here. Not so much the pressure, but certainly on the movement, and we're aiming to push this down on either end. I won't do that on here because I won't be able to demonstrate very well what I'm doing. It'll be much easier and clearer if we do this on the bench using a hammer. So before we start, we need to determine what our goal is. So if we measure the slot, it's starting off at 3.36 at one end and 3.32 at the other end. So let's make the assumption we want this to be 3.2 for argument's sake. It doesn't really matter. Then all we need to do is close it down at either end. We don't want to hit it in the middle because that will cause it to bow in. All we want to do is reduce the radius of these two bends. So I'll get it put back into the vise. Okay, now we have it in the vise and it's not going to bend over very easily. As long as we're careful, we can use the hammer to very carefully reduce the radius on the outside. So what we're trying to do, we don't want to hit it in the middle, that will cause it to bow in the centre. We're just trying to reduce the radius on the outside. Okay, so once we've done that a little bit, we'll take it out, remeasure the slot and see if we're getting any closer. I'm not aiming to use this to get it to the final dimension. I'm just trying to get the slot slightly too narrow. Okay, so that's in theory reduce this slightly. I think we said we're aiming for 3.2, so this should be slightly under 3.2. If not, we'll go a bit further. It's 3.13, 3.1. So we just need to do a very slight amount of filing and we can now open this back up to the final size. So all we need to do is hold this in the vise. So we'll clamp it in the vise, use the file and then just file it back out to the final size. I won't do that in this vise, I'll use the bench vise, but you kind of get the idea. I'll just do this off camera, but I'm just going to do a very slight amount of filing. Okay, so after about 30 seconds filing, we'll just measure what we've ended up with: 3.21 at that end and 3.21 at that end. So the slot is now within 100th of a millimetre of the size that we wanted. I'll give it a quick clean to get it back to the condition it was in to start with, and then that will be the job completed. Okay, so that's the part finished. It's ready to go back in the machine if it was a real part. As I said, I just made this one randomly to demonstrate the method, but that's how I reduced the width of the slot and got it tidied up on the calculator I was repairing. But the method you use is entirely up to you. It depends on the materials you have and the tools you've got. I normally use a hydraulic press for this sort of thing. I've got more control, but as you can see, you can use a hammer if you want to. Just don't beat on these randomly. It's and also try to avoid hitting on their faces. That's what really sort of tends to mess them up. And if you start getting dents and dings on the front face, firstly it will start to curl and distort, but also some of these are working surfaces and you don't want them galled up or messed up. Okay, so as I said, this video was just to address a request. Hopefully that's described what was being asked for. If you do want to see any more of this sort of thing and some of the repairs that I carry out, then let me know. Most people find it fairly boring, but if you do want to see more of this, then leave a comment.